In the mid-1990s, the Fraser Valley region of British Columbia represented what many Canadians considered an idyllic community, a place where families felt safe, where neighbors knew one another, and where violent crime seemed like something that happened elsewhere. Abbotsford, located 70 kilometers southeast of Vancouver in the heart of this agricultural belt, was known as the Bible Belt of Canada, a conservative, church-going community of approximately 110,000 residents. It was the last place anyone expected a predator to emerge from within, hiding behind the facade of normalcy while harboring violent urges that would eventually shatter the community's sense of security. The case of Terry Driver, who became known as the Abbotsford Killer, reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of violent crime in Canada, that sometimes the most dangerous offenders are not transient drifters moving between provinces but seemingly ordinary members of the community who live double lives until the moment their control finally breaks. Terry Driver was born on January 25, 1965, and grew up to embody what most would consider the model citizen. His father was a decorated former Vancouver police sergeant, which gave the family a respected position within law enforcement circles. Driver himself became a dedicated husband and father of 2 young children. He worked as a lead pressman at Abbotsford Printing Incorporated, where he had been employed for 4 years and was regarded as reliable and competent. He had previously served as a Boy Scout leader, working with youth in the community. Those who knew him described him as incapable of violence, a family man who seemed utterly ordinary. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior, Driver was wrestling with psychological issues that would later be identified in court. He was diagnosed with Tourette's syndrome, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. While these conditions alone do not cause violence, experts would later testify that Driver's obsessive-compulsive tendencies, combined with violent sexual urges, created a dangerous combination that he ultimately could not control. The first documented evidence of Driver's violent behavior came in September 1994, more than a year before his most notorious crime. He punched a woman in the face and dragged her by her legs to a secluded area in what appeared to be an attempted sexual assault. The victim escaped, but the crime went unreported or uninvestigated at the time. This attack demonstrated that Driver's violent impulses were not sudden or isolated, they had been building, and he had been acting on them in a pattern that would only escalate. What makes this particularly troubling is that had this earlier assault been properly investigated and prosecuted, the tragedy that followed might have been prevented. On the night of October 13, 1995, 16-year-old friends Tanya Smith and Misty Cockerill were walking to a birthday party near the former MSA hospital on McCallum Road in Abbotsford. It was approximately 12:30 in the morning when Terry Driver, then 30 years old, burst through a hedge carrying a baseball bat. He ordered both girls into the bushes at weapon point. Once they reached a clearing, Driver commanded them to remove their clothes. When Smith began to comply, Cockerill made a brave decision that would save her life. She grabbed the baseball bat and struck Driver across the back as he prepared to sexually assault Smith. Driver overpowered her and beat her repeatedly over the head with the bat, fracturing her skull, breaking her arm, and breaking her finger. Believing her to be dead or dying, Driver turned his full attention to Smith. He sexually assaulted her, beat her savagely with a bat, and left a bite mark on her breast. He then drove her to a fishing site on the Veta River and threw her body into the water, where she drowned, though the beating alone would have killed her. Miraculously, Cockerill regained consciousness in a parking lot and managed to walk to the hospital, where she was rushed into emergency surgery. Her survival would prove crucial to the investigation and prosecution. What followed Smith's murder was a 7-month campaign of psychological terror that traumatized the entire Fraser Valley. Driver, whose father had been a police officer, had an obsession with police scanners and used one to monitor law enforcement responses to his actions. He began making anonymous telephone calls to police and emergency services, clearly identifying himself as the killer and threatening to strike again. He attended Tanya Smith's funeral, mingling with mourners while knowing he was responsible for their grief. Days later, he returned to the cemetery, stole Smith's headstone, defaced it with threatening messages directed at Cockerill, and placed it on the hood of a vehicle belonging to a local radio station. In February 1996, he threw a wrench wrapped in tape through the front window of a stranger's home. Attached to the wrench was a note in which he confessed to the rape and murder of Smith, the assault on Cockerill, and claimed responsibility for 3 other similar assaults on women in Abbotsford. The note revealed someone who was feeding off the attention, someone who wanted credit for his crimes and enjoyed the fear he was generating. Law enforcement faced a significant challenge. They had a killer who was clearly intimately familiar with police procedures, who was monitoring their communications, and who was bold enough to taunt them publicly. The RCMP and Abbotsford police worked together, but without physical evidence linking a suspect to the crime. They were relying on the behavioral profile Driver was creating through his own actions. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, the media itself. Police made the strategic decision to release recordings of Driver as anonymous phone calls to local radio stations and television news programs. A $10,000 reward was offered for information leading to his arrest. When the calls were broadcast, 2 people immediately recognized the voice. Driver's own mother and his brother contacted police, providing the tip that would lead to his arrest. As former Abbotsford Mayor George Ferguson would later observe, Driver would never have been found without the reward and the media strategy, because he was known as a family man and had successfully hidden his violent nature from everyone around him. The forensic evidence that Driver had left behind proved crucial. He had left a thumbprint on the tape around the package he threw through the window. He had left DNA on Tanya Smith's body, and the bite mark on her breast provided additional forensic identification. When Driver was arrested in May 1996, he initially denied beating the 2 girls. In a bizarre attempt to minimize his culpability, he claimed he had simply happened upon them after someone else had attacked them, that he raped the unconscious Tanya and then threw her body in the river. This explanation was rejected by investigators and ultimately by the court. Driver elected to be tried by judge alone rather than a jury, hoping to avoid the emotional response his crimes would inevitably provoke. Justice Wally Oppel heard the case and in October 1997 found Driver guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Tanya Smith and attempted murder of Misty Cockerill. At sentencing, Justice Oppel stated, "I simply cannot find the words to describe and depict your horrible crimes. You murdered Tanya Smith for your own sexual gratification and you almost killed Misty Cockerill." Driver was sentenced to mandatory life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years on the murder conviction and a concurrent 10-year sentence for attempted murder. He was also convicted of sexual assault causing bodily harm, aggravated assault, and robbery. In January 2000, Driver stood trial for 2 of the other assaults he had referenced in his note and was convicted on both counts. He was then designated a dangerous offender, a legal classification in Canada that allows for indefinite incarceration beyond the original sentence if the offender is deemed a continuing threat to public safety. This designation proved prescient. Parole board documents revealed that Driver was involved in a violent incident in prison in 2007, and in 2019, while working as a caregiver in a prison program, he assaulted a client. A February 2021 psychological assessment determined Driver remained a very high risk for violent and sexual recidivism. When he applied for parole in April 2021, the board denied his application, stating, "The board remains ever mindful of the nature and gravity of your index offenses and the significance of the harm you have caused. Your actions have been life-altering and have caused serious harm." On August 23, 2021, Terry Driver died of apparent natural causes at Mountain Institution, a medium-security federal penitentiary in Agassiz, British Columbia. He was 56 years old. The Terry Driver case holds a particular place in Canadian criminal history, not because of the scale of his crimes. He was convicted of 1 murder and several assaults, but because of what his case revealed about the limitations of community awareness in identifying dangerous individuals. Unlike serial offenders who move between jurisdictions and evade detection through geographic mobility, Driver was embedded in his community, trusted and respected, hiding in plain sight. The case demonstrated the critical importance of media cooperation in criminal investigations, as it was the public broadcast of his own voice that led to his identification. It also highlighted the value of forensic evidence in an era when DNA analysis was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Perhaps most significantly, the case showed the courage of survivor Misty Cockerill, who not only testified against her attacker, but went on to become a victim's rights advocate, transforming her trauma into a mission to help others. The Driver case reminds us that in understanding and preventing violent crime, we must look not only at those who drift through our communities but also at those who appear to belong, recognizing that the capacity for violence can hide behind the most ordinary facades.